The beginning of the conflict arrived quietly, almost harmlessly, wrapped in strings of warm white Christmas lights. For years, the neighborhood had followed an unspoken tradition. As December approached, houses gradually transformed into glowing displays of holiday cheer. Some residents worked with modest strands along their roofs, while others embraced a more enthusiastic approach with lawn ornaments, wreaths, and animated projectors. The street shined brightly every winter, and it was the one time of year when neighbors who rarely spoke would pause, smile, and admire one another's displays. For the narrator, the lights were not simply decoration but a way to preserve family memories. Each year, the arrangement was slightly different, but the spirit behind it remained the same. A tribute to the narrator's late father, who had built that annual tradition long before the HOA was even formed. The lights represented warmth and unity, a soft reminder that despite tensions or disagreements throughout the year, the holiday season had the power to bring back a sense of community. But this year, something changed. The HOA board, newly reshuffled after a contentious election, decided that the neighborhood should reflect a more uniform aesthetic. They adopted strict guidelines. No lights before December 15th, no more than one strand per roofline, and absolutely no lawn ornaments. These new rules were added quietly, buried deep within a long email that few residents fully read. Most neighbors continued decorating the same way they always had, assuming the HOA had better things to do than enforce technicalities about holiday cheer. That assumption, however, proved wildly wrong. The narrator finished installing the decorations on December 1st, far earlier than the new rule allowed. The roofline glowed with warm white strands, tracing the shape of the home. The bushes sparkled with twinkling lights. A single wreath hung from the door, glowing quietly with a soft, battery-powered halo. Nothing extravagant, nothing loud or showy. Yet according to the newly rewritten rulebook, almost every detail counted as a violation. 3 days later, the first notice arrived at IT came in a crisp, overly formal envelope taped directly onto the narrator's door. Inside was a printed letter noting a violation of the community's holiday display ordinance, along with a photo of the narrator's house taken from the street. The fine listed at the bottom was jarring: $154 unauthorized installation of lights, with an additional $50 per day if the decorations were not removed immediately. The narrator reread the letter multiple times, struggling to understand how something so harmless could provoke such a response. After all, most neighbors had their lights up too. Some houses had far more elaborate displays, projectors painting their walls with dancing snowflakes, neon candy canes lined up across lawns, inflatable Santas towering over sidewalks. Yet none of them seemed to have fines taped to their doors. The unfairness of it all settled heavily in the narrator's mind. Over the next few days, a pattern emerged. The new HOA president, a person infamous for strict interpretations and power-driven policies, seemed to be targeting homes selectively. The narrator's house was visited repeatedly, each time with new demands. A second notice arrived, escalating the fine due to non-compliance. A third reminded the narrator that failure to pay fines could result in a lien against the property. The decorations, once symbols of peace and remembrance, suddenly felt like evidence in a manufactured crime. Meanwhile, neighbors were confused. Some whispered theories about why the narrator was being singled out. Others speculated that the HOA president had some personal grudge, though no one could name a reason. A few quietly removed their own decorations, afraid they might be next. But most houses remained brightly lit, with the HOA seemingly ignoring them. This selective enforcement only deepened the narrator's frustration. First, the narrator tried addressing the issue through proper channels. Emails were sent, politely asking for clarification. Calls were made to the HOA office, where messages were taken but never returned. Every attempt to resolve the matter peacefully was met with silence, evasion, or automated replies reminding the narrator of the mounting fines. Finally, after a week of escalating pressure, the narrator attended an HOA meeting. The meeting room was small and brightly lit, with folding chairs arranged in neat rows. Only a handful of residents showed up, most looking weary or resigned. The board members sat behind a long table with microphones, sipping water as though preparing for a press conference. When the narrator brought up the fines and the inconsistency in enforcement, The board dismissed the concerns with vague explanations. They insisted the rules were clear, the fines were justified, and any resemblance of selective targeting was pure coincidence. It was a cold, bureaucratic dismissal, not just of the narrator's complaint, but of the entire spirit behind holiday traditions. As the meeting dragged on, resentment simmered beneath the surface. The narrator felt a growing sense of indignation, not because of the fine itself, but because the situation symbolized something larger. It represented an HOA that had drifted far from serving the community and instead thrived on control and intimidation. That night, after returning home from the meeting, the narrator made a decision that if the HOA would not listen, perhaps the rest of the world would. The narrator recorded a short video explaining the situation. It was simple. Just a walkthrough of the house's decorations, the fine notices taped to the door, and a calm description of the HOA's behavior. The video captured the contrast between harmless holiday cheer and the harsh punishments being issued. The narrator posted it online with a straightforward caption: "HOA fined me $150 for Christmas lights." The next morning, everything changed. The video began gaining traction. First a handful of views, then hundreds, then thousands. Comments poured in from people who had their own HOA horror stories, expressing shock and sympathy. Some encouraged the narrator to stand firm, while others insisted the HOA's actions were illegal. The story climbed social media platforms, spreading far beyond the neighborhood. By the end of the day, news outlets began reaching out. Local reporters wanted interviews. Online publications requested permission to share the video. The story was quickly becoming viral, evolving from a neighborhood dispute into a public spectacle. The HOA, of course, had no idea what was coming. As the first chapter of this ordeal came to a close, the narrator could feel a shift in momentum. What began as an isolated conflict had now gained national attention. The world was watching, and the HOA's unjust behavior was about to face unprecedented scrutiny. The morning after the video went viral felt unlike anything the narrator had ever experienced. What began as a simple, frustrated act of sharing had transformed into a digital wildfire, spreading across platforms faster than anyone could track. Notifications flooded in. Comments appeared faster than they could be read. Messages from complete strangers, supportive, outraged, empathetic, poured into inboxes. The narrator watched the numbers climb in disbelief. By noon, the video had crossed 2 million views. That kind of sudden visibility had a strange, almost surreal feeling. The narrator found it difficult to fully process that a conflict that started on one quiet neighborhood street had become a national talking point. People shared their own HOA horror stories in the comments, turning the narrator's post into a gathering place for collective frustration. It became clear the issue was bigger than Christmas lights. It was about control, power, and the way small authorities sometimes crossed lines without consequences. The first contact came from a local news station. They asked for an interview, hoping to shed light on the growing controversy. The narrator hesitated at first, unsure about being so publicly involved, but the story had already gained too much traction to retreat. If anything, the narrator realized this was a chance to highlight a problem many people had silently endured. The news crew arrived that same afternoon. They filmed the decorations, the fine notices, and the neighborhood street. The narrator stood in front of the warmly lit house as they recorded narration describing what had happened, why the decorations were meaningful, how the fines began, and the complete lack of reasonable explanation from the HOA. The crew thanked the narrator and left, promising the segment would air during the evening broadcast. By sunset, the situation intensified. The local news story acted as a spark that ignited even more interest. It was shared across social media platforms, then picked up by larger outlets. National news sites wrote articles about it, framing it as an example of holiday joy clashing with overreaching regulations. Headlines used dramatic phrasing: HOA cracks down on Christmas spirit, homeowner fined for festive lights. When holiday cheer becomes a violation, soon morning shows and talk shows were covering it as well. Within 24 hours, the story had gone from viral video to national news. The neighborhood, once eerily quiet under the HOA's strict governance, now buzzed with an uncomfortable mixture of curiosity and tension. Cars drove slowly past the narrator's house, some simply wanting to see the infamous lights, others recording videos for their social media pages. A few neighbors offered whispered encouragement, quietly admitting they were glad someone had finally stood up to the HOA. Others glanced nervously at the narrator, clearly worried about being associated with the controversy. Across all of this, the HOA remained silent. But silence was not safety. The pressure around them steadily grew, building into something they could no longer avoid. One of the first signs of their internal panic appeared in the form of a hastily emailed statement sent to all residents. The HOA claimed the video circulating online was misleading and that the narrator had knowingly violated established community guidelines. They insisted the enforcement was fair, the fines reasonable, and the narrator's portrayal of events exaggerated. However, rather than calming the situation, the email had the opposite effect. Residents began forwarding the email to journalists, who compared it with the rules listed in the HOA handbook. Many pointed out inconsistencies and contradictions. Some discovered that the revised holiday rules had been added without a proper vote, a violation of the HOA's own bylaws. Others noticed that the rules were being enforced unevenly across the community. The narrative that the HOA tried to present quickly fell apart under scrutiny. Meanwhile, the narrator's video continued to rise in popularity. Reporters camped outside the neighborhood entrance, hoping to catch a glimpse of someone willing to speak on the matter. Several neighbors anonymously revealed their own frustrations with the HOA, describing years of strict enforcement, sudden rule changes, and punitive treatment. The story expanded beyond Christmas lights. It became a larger critique of the HOA system itself. Behind closed doors, the HOA board scrambled. The once confident president now found themselves the subject of national ridicule. Memes began circulating online, images of cartoonish HOA bosses demanding outrageous rules, overly dramatic graphics portraying holiday violations, and exaggerated depictions of the narrator's harmless decorations. The situation had transformed into a comedic storm that the HOA had no control over. The narrator watched from home, unsure whether to feel vindicated or overwhelmed. It was strange, knowing that millions of people were discussing a situation that had once seemed so personal and isolated. But there was comfort in recognizing the sheer volume of support from people across the world. The narrator no longer felt alone in the fight. There was a sense of empowerment, of a community bigger than the neighborhood itself standing behind the cause. Still, the uncertainty lingered. While the public laughed at the HOA's absurdity, the narrator grappled with the practical reality of the fines still sitting on record, accumulating daily. Even as the HOA avoided direct confrontation, they had not reversed their decision. The threat of property liens still hung silently in the background. And no matter how many people watched the story unfold, the narrator's home was still vulnerable to the whims of the board. Then came the turning point. A major national news network decided to feature the story in a primetime segment. They requested footage, documents, and a complete timeline of events. They planned to interview legal experts, HOA consultants, and ordinary residents to examine whether the HOA had violated state-level association laws. The narrator agreed, recognizing that this level of exposure might finally force the HOA to act responsibly. The network aired the segment that week. The broadcast drew millions of viewers in its first hour. Social media platforms exploded with reactions. Celebrities weighed in, mocking the HOA's decision and offering support. Influencers dissected the situation in reaction videos. Legal analysts appeared on live streams, explaining exactly how the HOA had overstepped its authority. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on the narrator's side. For the first time since the conflict began, the HOA appeared vulnerable. Their carefully constructed image of authority was in shambles. The neighborhood association, once feared by many residents, now faced nationwide humiliation. Pressure mounted from every direction: media, legal experts, residents, and the general public. It was clear they could not continue hiding behind silence and vague emails. Something had to give, and late one evening, the narrator received an unexpected notification. A representative from the HOA had requested an urgent meeting. What happened next would determine whether the story ended in resolution or further conflict. The request for an urgent meeting arrived with an uneasy sense of inevitability. After weeks of silence, denials, and escalating embarrassment, the HOA had finally reached a breaking point. The message was brief and formal, asking the narrator to arrive at the HOA office at a set time the following afternoon. No explanation. No mention of the fines. No acknowledgement of the chaos they had caused. Just a sterile appointment request, stripped of emotion. The narrator accepted, knowing this confrontation would mark the final stage of a battle that had spun far beyond a neighborhood dispute. Yet there was no sense of triumph, only a quiet determination. The narrator had never set out to become a national story or a symbol of resistance against authoritarian HOAs. The goal was simply to be treated fairly. But now, with millions watching, fairness would no longer be enough. Accountability was required. When the narrator arrived at the HOA office, the atmosphere was tense. The usually pristine lobby felt different, dim, heavy, almost nervous. Through a small glass window, the board members sat at the long table, their expressions strained. Gone were their confident postures, their self-assured glances, their subtle smirks of authority. They looked defeated, exhausted, and cornered. The narrator entered, taking a seat across from them. The meeting began with an awkward stillness. The board members exchanged glances, silently urging one another to speak first. Eventually, the HOA president cleared their throat and attempted to maintain a semblance of professionalism. Yet beneath the polished tone, a tremor of panic lingered. They explained that the recent attention had created unexpected complications for the community. They claimed that the situation had grown beyond what was intended. They insisted the fines were issued according to policy but acknowledged the perception of unfairness. Their words were carefully chosen, but the meaning was empty. What followed was a formal offer. The fines would be waived in light of recent events, and the holiday display rules would be temporarily suspended pending review. The HOA hoped this gesture would restore goodwill and put an end to the escalating attention. But the narrator knew the truth. This was not an apology. It was an attempt at damage control, an effort to quiet the storm rather than accept responsibility. The room felt like a stage where the HOA hoped a small concession would close the curtains. But the narrator recognized that the impact of the story had stretched far beyond the neighborhood. People everywhere were paying attention because they, too, had experienced similar injustices. And so, the narrator declined the offer. Not the fine reversal. Not the suspension of rules. Those were welcome but insufficient. What the narrator refused was the notion of quietly ending the story behind closed doors, leaving the community unaware, the public misled, and the HOA unchallenged. There needed to be transparency, a genuine acknowledgement, a correction of the narrative the HOA had tried to force upon residents. The narrator demanded a public statement. For a moment, the board sat frozen, as though the idea had never occurred to them. Public statement would mean admitting fault. It would mean acknowledging selective enforcement, questionable rule changes, and overreach. It would mean damaging their reputation, not repair it. The HOA president hesitated, but the narrator held firm. The decision was not up for negotiation. Cornered by national scrutiny, legal experts, and the growing resistance of their own neighborhood, the board finally agreed. They would issue an official apology, public, written, and distributed to all residents and the news outlets covering the story. The meeting ended quietly. There were no handshakes, no cordial farewells. Only the understanding that a system built on intimidation had finally been forced into accountability. The following morning, the apology was released. It appeared first in email inboxes, then across social media, and eventually in the news. The HOA acknowledged that the enforcement of the holiday rules did not reflect the values or intentions of the association. They admitted that the rules had been updated without proper community voting. They confessed that fines had been issued inconsistently and that the narrator's decorations were not excessive, disruptive, or inappropriate. Most importantly, they apologized directly to the narrator, stating that the fines should never have been issued. The reaction was immediate. Online communities erupted with satisfaction. Supporters celebrated the victory. News outlets highlighted the apology as a rare moment of accountability in the often unchecked world of HOA governance. Legal analysts praised the narrator for standing firm, calling the story an example of how public pressure could hold small institutions responsible. The public sentiment was overwhelmingly positive. The neighborhood itself felt transformed. Residents who had previously remained silent now openly shared their frustrations. Some approached the narrator with quiet gratitude, explaining how they had feared retaliation in the past. Others expressed relief that the HOA had finally been exposed. Many felt inspired to push for change, calling for new elections, fairer rules, and more transparent decision-making. In the weeks that followed, meetings were held to revise policies. The holiday rules were completely rewritten, this time with community votes and input. Other regulations were reviewed as well, ensuring consistency and fairness. The HOA president, facing immense pressure and dwindling support, eventually resigned. New leadership took over, promising openness and communication rather than control and intimidation. As the holiday season approached its peak, the narrator's home became a symbol of the victory. Families walked by in the evenings to admire the lights. Children pointed excitedly at the glowing roofline. The decorations no longer represented just personal memories. They now stood as a reminder of what could happen when someone refused to stay silent in the face of unfair treatment. The narrator's online following grew, but the attention gradually settled into something steady and supportive rather than overwhelming. Messages continued to arrive, people sharing stories, thanking the narrator for speaking up, or simply offering kind words during the holidays. The overwhelming chaos of the viral moment faded, replaced by a sense of peace and accomplishment. Eventually, the narrator posted one final update online, describing how the situation had resolved. It was not dramatic or sensational, just honest. The post served as closure, both for the narrator and for the millions who had followed the story from the first viral video to the HOA's public apology. Life returned to normal, but something had changed permanently. The narrator no longer saw the HOA as a looming threat. Neighbors felt more connected. The community felt less controlled and more empowered. And every evening, when the holiday lights switched on, the narrator felt a quiet sense of justice. What began as a simple display of Christmas cheer had evolved into a national conversation, a neighborhood transformation, and a personal triumph. The lights, once the target of fines, now symbolized resilience, unity, and the power of one voice amplified by millions. And as the season drew to a close, the neighborhood glowed brighter than ever.